Since December 2023, Ukraine has been in accession negotiations with the European Union or EU, but it has been blocked at every turn. The leader of one country, whom some have started calling Vladimir Putin's pawn, has consistently stood in the way. The sole dissenting voice in an organization that wants Ukraine. Now that voice is silenced. And it's happened thanks to the most unexpected of influences, the US President Donald Trump. Even Europe is shocked by a surprise US deal Trump has made that will open the door for Ukraine's EU membership. The deal was made with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. On August 27th, United 24 media reported that Trump and Orban recently held a telephone call that resulted in Orban being convinced to drop his blockade of Ukraine's accession to the EU. We don't know much about this deal beyond that. United 24 cites Politico as the source of this news, which in turn claims that its information came from unnamed diplomatic sources who are close to the situation. Furthermore, it isn't clear what Trump said that managed to convince Orban to drop his attempts to block Ukraine's EU membership. Did Trump make a threat? Did he offer a better deal with the US than Orban is getting from Vladimir Putin? We don't know the answers to these questions, and Orban isn't saying anything. He has yet to make any official comment about his reported change of heart, perhaps waiting until an opportune moment to make a joint announcement with Trump. As for Politico's report, it quoted one of its unnamed diplomats as saying that Orban now has the possibility to climb down from the anti-Ukraine tree. Another of Politico's sources put the outcome bluntly. This fact has changed the situation regarding Ukraine's accession to the EU, the source said. That's all we know for sure about Orban's change of heart, at least for now. However, Ukraine may not be the only prospective EU member that's going to have its accession unblocked. On August 27th, Politico reported that leaders of Germany, France, and Poland are all going to be visiting Moldova in an effort to urge that country's voters to reject Russian influence and maintain their pro-EU government. Like Ukraine, Moldova isn't a member of the EU, having lodged its application in March 2022. Also, like Ukraine, Moldova has faced delay after delay in having that application ratified into an official membership, which has opened the door for Russian influence to creep into the country, potentially derailing the entire bid. The visit from three prominent EU leaders comes about a month before Moldovan President Maia Sandu faces a parliamentary election on September 28th. Sandu only just won re-election by the skin of her teeth a year ago, in an election that was marred by vote rigging that Politico says included a Kremlin scheme that saw voters being paid to vote for her opposition. During the same election, a referendum on EU membership was also held. That also just scraped through in the EU's favour, with a vote of 50.4% for versus 49.6% against. Moldova is a country on the brink, but it also represents an opportunity for the EU. If the three leaders heading to Moldova are able to push the pendulum in favour of the country's pro-EU government, the organisation may have just scored two major wins in August. Getting Moldova would be good. Ukraine entering the EU, thanks to Orban's constant objections finally disappearing, would be great. Why? Well, we'll answer that question later in the video. First, it's important to get a little bit of context on Viktor Orban and his seemingly constant efforts to undermine Ukraine over the last couple of years. Orban has always been a slippery individual when it comes to the Ukraine war. Back in December 2023, the BBC published a piece in which it asked the question of what Hungary's leader had against Ukraine. Written in the wake of Orban having used his veto power to stop a $55 billion EU aid package that was supposed to support Ukraine up until 2027, the BBC reported that Orban had warned Ukraine that he could pull the handbrake on any future support that the EU tried to provide. The same outlet also points out that Orban isn't exactly a supporter of Ukraine or Moldova joining the EU. He has allowed negotiations to begin without using any of his veto powers, though he did so begrudgingly, the BBC says. When the EU's members were asked to vote on allowing these negotiations on behalf of both countries, Orban walked out of the room, abstaining from the vote while leaving the EU's other 26 members to reach a unanimous yes decision. After the fact, he called that successful vote a bad decision, while noting that Hungary has a strong enough voice to stop the accession of Ukraine and Moldova at any time. This is clearly a man who has an axe to grind. The reasons why are varied and dependent on the source. Interestingly, an opinion piece written by the Hungary Foundation's Balázs Tarnok for the Washington Times back in June 2021 provided some insight into the thought process within Hungary before Putin invaded Ukraine. In that piece, Tarnok noted that Hungary had been blocking political meetings between NATO and Ukraine since 2018, leading some to call Hungary a Trojan horse for Russia in the Collective Defense Organization. These accusations weren't inaccurate, Tarnok argued. He said that the reason for Hungary's blockades, at least regarding NATO, stemmed from the law on education that Ukraine's parliament passed in 2017. That law, Tarnok said, further limited the ability of ethnic minorities living in Ukraine to get an education in their native language. This was followed by another law in 2019 that made the use of the Ukrainian language compulsory in all aspects of public life, Tarnok says. To Hungary, these actions represented a worrying trend within Ukraine for anti-minority practices. He points out that Hungary as a nation maintains a special bond with ethnic Hungarians who live beyond their country's borders. He says that Hungary's fundamental law, which was created when the country gained its independence, reinforces that bond. Taking away the fundamental right of an ethnic Hungarian living in Ukraine to speak their native language served as a clear violation of this fundamental law, Tarnok argued, making Hungary's later efforts to block Ukraine from integrating into organizations of which Hungary is a part. Of course, Ukraine sees things differently, as Tarnok points out. Although the main goal of the new legislation was to tackle Russian influence in eastern Ukraine, Ukraine, as collateral damage, obstructed the use of all minority languages, including Bulgarian, Greek, Hungarian, Romanian, and Polish, he writes. Hungary's problem, then, is that the actions Ukraine was taking to curb pro-Russian influences inside the country in the years before Putin launched his invasion were too sweeping. It's understandable that Ukraine wanted to eradicate Russian influence, especially given what happened just 8 months after Tarnok wrote his piece. But at the same time, this desire for eradication can't be so far-reaching that it hurts ethnic Hungarians who may choose Ukraine as their home. Ultimately, Tarnok makes the point that Hungary was wary about potential human rights violations back in 2021. Assuming those concerns still exist in 2025, now that Ukraine is a war-torn country thanks to Russia, this argument at least provides somewhat diplomatic reasoning for Orban's past desire to block Ukraine from achieving EU membership. Tarnok makes some good points. However, the BBC's December 2023 piece offers some counters. It says that there appears to be some kind of personal issue between Orban and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, citing a then-recent Brussels summit. Where every other EU leader took the opportunity to have their photograph with Zelensky, Orban turned and walked away, much as he did for the vote on whether to allow Ukraine to begin accession negotiations. Orban and Zelensky were later photographed engaged in what seemed like an intense conversation during the inauguration of Argentina's new president. Zelensky apparently asked Orban why he was blocking Ukraine's EU membership. If Orban provided an answer, Zelensky didn't reveal it. Even earlier, in April 2022, Politico reported that Orban also appears to have been unhappy with Zelensky, implying that the Hungarian leader's relationship with Putin was a little too warm. Hungary even summoned the Ukrainian envoy to the country to decry what it said were insulting and unacceptable statements made by Zelensky to that effect. The country's foreign minister, Peter Szijjarto, later took to Facebook to explain, "It's time for Ukrainian leaders to stop insulting Hungary and take into account the will of the Hungarian people," he said. Statements about the regret of the will of the Hungarian people are unacceptable. It's clear that there is no love lost between the two leaders, and this personal animosity has likely been a factor in Hungary's actions. Concerns about Ukraine's laws may have given way to the simpler explanation that Orban simply doesn't like Zelensky, or the implications that Ukraine's president had made about Orban's ties to Putin. However, some would argue that Zelensky was justified in his stance. After all, Orban has indeed maintained a relationship with Putin throughout the Ukraine war. In July 2024, Hungary's leader even flew to Moscow to meet Putin in a move that other EU leaders heavily criticized, the BBC reports. When the rest of the EU was trying to freeze Putin out, Orban was shaking the man's hand, long before Trump also made the controversial decision to break ice with Russia's leader. The 2024 meeting came on the back of another in October 2023, in which Orban is reported to have told Putin that Hungary never wanted to confront Russia. Hungary always has been eager to expand contacts. Again, that's evidence for Zelensky's case. Throughout the war, Orban has tried to walk a tightrope in which he condemns the war itself for taking place, but never seems to go far enough as to condemn Putin for starting the war with his February 2022 invasion. At times, Orban has been taking a risk of falling off that tightrope, as he has been the sole dissenting voice on several occasions in an effort to prevent the EU from imposing sanctions on Russia's gas and oil. And of course, there is his veto on the 3 years of EU aid we mentioned earlier. More suggestions that Orban is more pro-Putin than the rest of the EU would have liked came in October 2024. According to Reuters, Orban used a briefing held in Strasbourg to argue that it was impossible for Ukraine to win the war on the battlefield, and that dialogue and ceasefire were required to save lives on both sides. Interestingly, this is the same approach that Trump has taken since he became US president, which may go some way to explaining why Trump was able to get through to Orban. Trump is trying to open the dialogues and create the ceasefires that Orban says are necessary. Perhaps the US president has managed to convince Hungary's prime minister that the leverage Ukraine would gain from EU membership could be enough to bring Russia to the negotiating table. Again, we don't know. But Orban hadn't become any more pro-Ukraine in 2025, which makes his recent flip-flop all the more surprising. As United24 points out, Orban has maintained a hardline stance against Ukraine's EU membership, going so far as to share his completed ballot as part of a nationwide consultation on Ukraine's membership that his government launched. Orban voted no on that ballot and was happy to let the world know. Posting to Facebook and reported by United24, Hungary's leader said, "Brussels and the Tisza party support Ukraine's EU accession. This would destroy the Hungarian economy. We won't let them decide our future over our heads. I've already voted." The implication here is that Ukraine being in the EU would seriously damage the economic relationship between Russia and Hungary. That's a pretty strong relationship. Trading Economics says that Hungary exported $1.04 billion worth of goods and services to Russia in 2024. That's significantly down on previous years, but it shows that the two countries are doing business. Balkan Insight also said in December 2024 that Hungary has turned itself into a hub for Russian gas, which means it's likely profiting from serving as an intermediary between Russia and other countries that need Russia's gas. Finally, as late as June 2025, Hungary was still blocking Ukraine's EU membership. This time, Orban explained himself by saying, "We wouldn't want to be in the same community as a country at war." The reasons kept evolving. But until August 18th and Trump's phone call with Orban, the outcome was always the same. Hungary said no. Now it's saying yes. And that means everything is about to change, which brings us back to the question we posed earlier in the video about why Ukraine entering the EU will be great for the collective. The first reason is simple. The EU neighborhood is about to expand. One of Putin's greatest fears is that countries that were once part of the Soviet bloc are becoming increasingly westernized through their memberships in organizations like the EU and NATO. His relentless efforts to take over Ukraine are a direct response to this fear, as Putin will reason that Ukraine can't become an EU member if it's part of Russia. The European Center for International Political Economy notes that successive enlargements of the EU have become one of the organization's most successful policies, not least because it means that it's the EU, not Russia, that exerts the lion's share of the influence over European geopolitics. A piece published by the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, or TBI, reinforces this point. It notes that Ukraine has evolved into a major military power that would add significantly to the EU's defense capabilities. TBI also notes that Ukraine has a highly skilled workforce, as evidenced by the advancements in drone technology driven by Ukraine's innovation during its fight against Russia, and that Ukraine's status as a major global agricultural producer could go a long way to ensuring greater food security throughout Europe. Ukraine was traditionally considered a breadbasket of Europe. Over 71% of its surface is agricultural land and 56% is arable. Before the war, Ukraine's agricultural sector accounted for 11% of GDP, 20% of its workforce, and around 40% of exports, TBI says. A surprising level of economic strength is another thing that Ukraine brings to the EU, which brings us back to our second reason. Beyond its strong agricultural sector, Ukraine is a tech giant, at least in European terms. About 45% of the country's exports were IT-related in 2022, compared to the EU's total share of IT exports being about 17%. Ukraine's IT exports have naturally declined due to its war with Russia, but even in 2024, IT accounted for 38.4% of the country's exports, according to the World Bank. With Ukraine welcomed into the fold, the EU becomes a technological powerhouse, one that contains countries that could greatly benefit from Ukraine's innovation. There's a lot of wealth contained within Ukraine's land in the form of rare earth minerals. The BBC says that Ukraine estimates that it's home to 5% of the world's critical raw minerals. Those minerals include about 19 million proven reserves of graphite, making Ukraine one of the world's top 5 countries when it comes to supplies of that mineral. Ukrainian reserves account for 7% of Europe's supply of titanium, over 30% of the continent's lithium, and significant deposits of copper, silver, nickel, cobalt, lead, and uranium. These resources are worth billions of dollars. In May, BBC reported that the land Russia currently occupies in Ukraine accounts for around $350 billion in minerals, and there are many billions more besides to consider. In an era where the global supply of key commodities is hotly contested and significant efforts are being made to ensure more strategic autonomy in supply, Ukraine's critical raw material supplies will be a welcome addition to the EU, not least given the fact that they are the key enabling factor in energy transition and independence for Europe, TBI says. Sticking with the economic theme, Ukraine's entry into the EU also means it gains access to the EU's single market. It's here that the clearest economic benefit of EU membership comes to Ukraine. According to the EU itself, the single internal market ensures the free movement of goods, services, capital, and persons within the EU, creating far easier mechanisms for trade and immigration. Essentially, the single market is the closest the EU is able to come to turning Europe into a single entity, at least among its members. Red tape is slashed and trade becomes a lot easier between the EU's members thanks to this single market philosophy. As of 2023, the EU is Ukraine's largest trading partner. The organization accounted for 56% of Ukraine's goods trade in 2023, TBI says. Single market membership could mean that Ukraine is able to lean more heavily into this already healthy trade relationship, generating billions of dollars of revenue in the process. And of course, all of these reasons also amount to perhaps the major benefit that Ukraine is looking to get from its EU membership. It moves closer to the West and further away from Russia. With the EU having a vested interest in Ukraine's sovereignty due to the economic and military ties that would result from Ukraine's EU membership, it has even more reason to aid the country in its fight against Russia. That's precisely what Putin feared, as we mentioned earlier. With the door now open to EU membership, Ukraine is on the verge of completing its transition from a sovereign nation filled with echoes of its Soviet past into a fully fledged and westernized member of modern-day Europe. That's what makes Trump's August 18th achievement so important. Orban was the last and largest obstacle standing in the way of both Ukraine and the EU as a whole experiencing the benefits that we've just outlined. Hungary's prime minister certainly won't become a non-factor. We still don't know what Trump said to convince Orban to change his tune, and we don't know how or if Hungary's leader will carry on trying to walk the tightrope between its EU membership and its relationship with Russia. Perhaps this news might spell the end of the warm relationship between Orban and Putin. For now, we have to wait and see. The only certain thing is that if the reports are true, the entire geopolitical landscape in Europe has changed forever. Russia has lost big here, as the path is now clear for Ukraine to do something that Putin has been trying to prevent for years. And while Putin is dealing with all of that, another EU member has just sent a dagger flying straight into Russia's heart. Belgium has had enough, and it's about to send Ukraine the one piece of equipment that Putin fears the most in record numbers. Find out what that equipment is and why Putin fears it in our video. And if you like this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more updates on the latest developments in Ukraine's status with the EU. And thank you, as always, for watching.